Changing colour again here, I want to talk particularly about consent just for a few moments, particularly because I think that consent has been the historical gold standard for processing of personal data in the context of research. And in the UK, there is a massive shift away from relying on consent, and the way that the GDPR seems to provide for that move away from consent is really being harnessed in the advice that is being given to research organisations. So under the General Data Protection Regulation, there is a definition of consent under Article 4. And it says the kind of things that we always expect to hear about consent, that it must be informed, it must be freely given, it must be unambiguous, it must be specific. It's clear that consent needs to be an affirmative action. So there's no such thing as opt-out consent. You can't have a pre-ticked box. Somebody has to actually do something active in order to demonstrate that they do consent to that processing of their personal data. It doesn't need to be a signature. It could be ticking a box, but it can't be unchecking a ticked box. The General Data Protection Regulation doesn't give a definition of explicit consent. And if I just go up slightly, you might remember that the lawful basis for processing special categories of personal data in Article 9(2)(a) requires that the subject gives explicit consent. In the UK, the way that that's been interpreted is that there needs to be a specific statement saying that the person gives consent. So the Information Commissioner's Office has said where explicit consent is required, it needs to be more than an affirmative action. So there needs to be something specifically saying, I consent to the use of my data or the processing of my personal data for this reason. And this has been important in things like where we may have presumed consent, where somebody fills in a health questionnaire for the purposes of research. We may have presumed consent as an act of actually filling in the questionnaire. And it seems that if we're relying on explicit consent, that won't be sufficient, and that actually there will need to be a specific statement. Obviously, if you're not processing a special category of personal data, then it may be that consent can just be signified by this affirmative act and you wouldn't require that explicit statement. But it may be that other member states have interpreted that slightly differently. So where processing is based on consent, the onus is on the data subject to demonstrate this. And this can be quite problematic in certain circumstances. Consent can't be bundled up with other consent to other processing which is not required for the particular purpose. So it needs to be disaggregated from things that it's not related to. Maybe if you do have to consent to both of the two things in order for that processing to happen, that's okay. But if you're being asked to consent to it as part of something else and you don't need to consent to both of those things, then it would not be seen as freely given. And where processing is based on consent, there has to be the right to withdraw consent at any time. And this needs to be just as easy as it was to give consent. So if you can give consent by text, you need to be able to withdraw consent by text, and you wouldn't, it wouldn't be just as easy if you had to go through a lengthy telephone process to withdraw your consent. So consent is one way to comply with the GDPR, and as I said, the policy position in the UK is that it is in no way elevated over the other lawful basis in the GDPR. Particularly, some institutions may be being advised to move away from using consent as the lawful basis because of difficulties in the GDPR of demonstrating that that consent is freely given. So we have quite a all-encompassing definition of what a public authority is in the UK. And the GDPR says that there is a presumption that where there's an imbalance of power, and it gives the relationship between an individual and a public authority as being a paradigm of that imbalance of power. It says that consent cannot be considered to be freely given in those circumstances. So public authorities are well advised to rely on an alternative basis to consent, on the basis that it's going to be difficult for them to demonstrate that the consent was freely given. So because consent is not preferred over other legal basis, there's been this big shift away from consent as the lawful basis for processing in the context of processing data for scientific research purposes. Nevertheless, the problem that we're having in the UK, and hopefully this does chime with the problem that people are encountering in other member states, is disaggregating what's required under the common law duty of confidentiality by way of consent and what's required under the General Data Protection Regulation. So the General Data Protection Regulation doesn't affect the common law duty of confidence. So in the UK, that comes from our case-made law. And where you collect health data about people, then you almost always will be doing that in the context of a confidential relationship. And that's particularly an issue where you're collecting it as part of their healthcare. The organisations would not need to change their consent practices to comply with the GDPR in order to maintain confidence. They're two very separate regimes. And in England, the consent requirements in order to negate an action for breach of confidence are not the same as the consent requirements to provide a valid consent under the GDPR. So in many circumstances in England, we actually rely on implied consent for processing personal data in a way that doesn't breach confidence. So when a patient gives information to a health professional, that information will be used in many ways which are for the care of that person. So they'll be passed to other people involved in the care, they'll be used for auditing purposes, and it will be taken that the person impliedly consents to that. In England, data may also flow for research purposes without patient consent under other statutory bases. So you don't need to give an explicit consent to many flows of patient data. However, this will not suffice for the GDPR. There's no such thing, I don't think, as implied consent under the GDPR. But you do need to still ensure that you meet the common law duty of confidence. So one of the problems that people are having getting their head around is that they may need to get a consent in order to ensure that they are meeting their common law duty of confidence, but they may rely on a different basis under the GDPR. So consent for confidence, and then rely perhaps on the fact that they're a public authority and the research exemption in order to meet their data protection regulation responsibilities. So it's only if you're relying on consent as the basis for your lawful processing under the GDPR that your consent needs to be GDPR compliant. So what does this mean for the concept of broad consent under the GDPR? It does seem that the concept of broad consent is to a certain extent preserved, but this is really only clear from the recitals rather than from the articles. But the recitals do allow for people to consent to certain areas of scientific research rather than consenting to specific research projects. So that it does still preserve this idea that consent doesn't have to be something that only relates to one specific project, and then you need to get a new consent every time you ask somebody to be part of a different research project. This hasn't been particularly fleshed out in the UK because, as I said, the policy advice from most of the government organisations is that researchers and data controllers and data processors shouldn't be relying on consent for the processing of data for scientific research purposes. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is whether this actually sets us apart from other member states where it may be that consent is still seen as being much more important lawful basis.